You know, I feel like if you grew up, I don't know, in the last 20 years, you're probably a lot more familiar with dystopia and dystopian visions than you are with utopian visions, which, you know, after all, came first. We're going to talk about utopian visions today, about the notion of a utopia, about ways in which that notion has been put into play in real life, about intentional communities, and we have terrific... I'm so excited about this show. I have not been so pepped up in quite some time. We have terrific guests to do that, and so let's get going without further ado. So for the first segment, Avery Trufelman is the host of the podcast Nice Try! The first season of which is all about utopian efforts, about people who tried to design a better world. The second season of the podcast will be released in the fall. I'm excited. I'm hooked. I want to hear whatever comes next. And for two segments here, first and second ones, Akash Kapoor is the author of Better to Have Gone: Love, Death, and the Quest for Utopia in Auroville. And I just want to say, this is one of the books of the year. There's sort of no question about this. This is an amazing memoir / history / I don't even know. There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of slashes in there, a lot of things going on in this book. So, Akash Kapoor, I could think maybe I'll begin with you because this is something that you've written about not only in this book but elsewhere. Maybe we should begin by introducing people to the origins of at least the word utopia. We can go back further to Plato, but it's a guy that we know either from Wolf Hall or A Man for All Seasons, depending on whether we want the sort of malevolent or benevolent version of him. So tell us who gives us utopia.
Sure. Well, the word is coined by Sir Thomas More, who, as you know from Wolf Hall, was an English nobleman. But he actually wrote a book called Utopia. And there's some debate about the origins of the word utopia and what it actually means. But, generally, most people think it comes from the Greek word and basically means no place, which is a good place to start with utopia, because I think part of the reason utopia has a bad rep and has a bad image is because it is, by definition, unattainable.
Right. And there's also a way in which, utopia feels like a reaction formation, what psychoanalysis would call a reaction formation, an attempt to build something to quell your anxieties or sense of fear and loathing about something that's actually happened. In the case of Moore, you almost feel like it's an alternative to him, right? He's the epitome of religious intolerance. So he invents this utopia in which religious tolerance is practiced.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thought. I think it's right that utopia, one of the useful ways of thinking about utopia is less as a place that exists or will exist, but as a critique of what exists and as an imagination of alternatives to what exists. And so, I think the idea of utopia as a reaction is an interesting one, though one that, many utopians might reject because they see themselves as kind of existing completely in a different universe and a completely different alternative that would not be defined in opposition to what is.
Although, Avery, just to go through your whole podcast series, it's hard to let go of the reaction formation idea. People are creating utopias because of something that just recently happened. I mean, even like Biosphere 2 is one of your utopias, and that's clearly a lot of people worried about all the danger signs, all the blinking lights that are flashing on the dashboard of the world.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, in a weird way, seeking utopia is a quest for control. Like, we didn't have any choice into this society we were born into this planet we were born into, in the case of the creation of Biosphere 2, which is a totally bonkers story, like a crazy bonkers story. But very long bonkers story short, I mean, it was created as like an alternative world. What if we have to go to space? What if we have to exist somewhere else? Can we create a synthetic version of the whole Earth's ecology and live off of it and farm it and tend it and be self-sufficient? And it ended up just being a complete fiasco, disaster. The people inside basically starved. But it was really in pursuit of like, there has to be another way. And so many of the utopias, that we at least talk about on Nice Try, are people trying to escape their class, their race, their environment. It's seizing this idea of like, maybe there can be a choice. Maybe I can find another way. I don't have to accept this world the way it is. And I think, I mean, I'm sure we'll get into this, but I think that's why we have to continue to reach for this impossible place, because we do have to believe that there is a choice. Like, I think we do have to believe that we can seize some version of control into these like set of circumstances we've been born into.
I think also there's a little bit of a sense that many a failed utopia has kind of a silver lining. And you know, I would even push back based entirely on your narrative about it on Biosphere 2. There's a sense when the people walk out of there, yes, in a way that eerily mimics Jamestown, which hopefully we can talk about if there's time, but in a way that they've been sneaking seeds that they were supposed to be planting to grow more produce, and instead they're getting so hungry that they're very sneakily actually eating the seeds. But you know, as they come out, I mean, they stayed in the amount of time they were supposed to be there. They come out, they're a little gaunt, but they're kind of healthier. They can't even eat the crap that we eat, right?
That's true. No, you bring up a very good point, which is that we need to trouble our notion of what success and failure is and what utopia is, because, right, just like there is no such thing as a perfect place, there's no such thing as like complete success. Every endeavor will have its failures. And I think a huge reason a lot of utopias do really spiral into dangerous territory is that people are afraid to admit failure in their pursuit for utopia. Like, for example, in the case of Biosphere 2, I mean, it succeeded in a lot of ways. It made some genuine scientific discoveries. The people inside this glass palace in the middle of the Arizona desert really did live there for 2 years. But I think, you know, it's too easy to just call something a success or a failure. And I think the people who were in charge of the experiment were very hell-bent on making sure everything looked good and everything was fine. And they were unwilling to admit like smaller shortcomings. And I mean, we can see this in I've been thinking about this a lot, looking at what's going on in Afghanistan right now. Like, an inability to admit small failures incrementally along the way can lead to like giant mistakes that can be quite dangerous. And so, yeah, you know, in a weird way, I want to redact my statement. Like, it wasn't a complete debacle, but a lot of things went wrong
right.
in this particular search for utopia.
And I think I'm not even going to explain why, because I want people to listen to the episode. But you know, things are going wrong when Steve Bannon shows up. That's almost never a good sign for your utopian vision, that Steve Bannon is taking an interest in what you're doing. So, you know, Akash, I was actually on the Auroville official website today, and there's like an FAQ thing on it. And one of the things it made me think a little bit about one of the other ways utopias can run the risk of venturing into dangerous territories. There was the sentence: the use of law courts or referral to other outsiders is considered unacceptable and to be avoided if possible. And, you know, I mean, implicit in almost every utopian enterprise or bargain is the notion that we know better, right? We know a better way to do this than our existing society. It's what you just said a few seconds ago. It's an implied critique of the way things are. But there's a limit to how much you can do that, right? Because it's not Jamestown. It's not a place that's way, way far away. Every place is cheek to jowl with another place now. And maybe you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that the kind of tension between the self-contained utopia that's sort of a laboratory for a new world and trying to create a model for, you know, that will then propagate outwards and change the world, the tension between that and the world itself and the way it's sort of undeniable and crowding in is always a problem in these utopias. One of the ways that I saw, you know, growing up in Orville, and I think you often see in these utopias where it plays out most strongly is in the economy, because there's always an urge to kind of recreate the economy, get rid of money, create a more egalitarian society, all of which, I mean, I think are very noble ambitions. And, you know, I don't by any means have a problem with the ambition, but it's very tough, you know, and I have scenes in my book where they're early on, they're going to start a bakery and they're not going to charge money. And they come up with this kind of like circuitous way because nobody can buy bread and yet there's not enough money to actually bake the bread. So you have to go cycle somewhere and get your grains and then bring it to the bakery, and the bakery will, you know, bake your bread for you. But you end up with these kind of totally convoluted schemes. So yeah, I think that tension is very real. I also just wanted to say on the earlier thing that you guys were just talking about, like, I don't think that the problem with utopia is failure. I mean, you know, failure is a very subjective notion. And failure can be noble. And as you say, there's often a silver lining to failure. I think the problem, and maybe this is something that Avery was getting at, the problem is what happens on the way to failure. That many of these places stray into very dark places in their desperate quest for success.
That's a really interesting way to put it. And I want to follow up on that in just a second. Although since we're on the whole subject of putting bread on the table, so to speak, there's another aspect to this, and there's another way that this can go, and one that you're both very familiar with. So every one of your episodes is about Oneida. So this is another thing that can happen, is that even a utopian intentional community that may start out with an idea of operating very, very differently from the rest of society, a lot of them kind of figure out, particularly the ones that last a while, figure out, actually we could make stuff and sell it back to the outsiders. We could do stuff. And I mean, Oneida is an amazing example of that.
Yeah, Oneida is a very interesting example. Oneida is a silverware company that still exists today. It's actually one of the largest in the game, and it began truly as almost a textbook example of an intentional community in like the mid 1800s. And one of the interesting things about it is they started out as they were into polyamory and gender parity and all these really radical ideas for the mid 1800s that were totally antithetical to the idea of a conventional family life. And then by the mid 20th century, they were selling these like products for your table, which were marketed to the traditional family unit in their little white picket fences. And so they really did this kind of strange about face. But I think, another thing that comes up with a lot of these intentional communities is so much of the change was generational. There was this whole generation of children who grew up in this intentional community, feeling like outsiders, feeling cut off from the world, wanting a sense of larger belonging, wanting to explore. And they basically rebelled against their parents' values, and their parents' values weren't really able to keep up with the times. And so that's a really common thread we see across a lot of intentional communities, that the second generation doesn't quite agree with the way they were raised. And then, the leadership can't really control them in the way they could perhaps with their parents.
And at a certain point, they run, to our previous point, they run afoul of the law, too. There were certain things, ways in which the leader of Oneida wanted to sexually initiate very young women that were, even just what looked to the outside world like adultery was illegal at the time. There were a lot of those kinds of problems. But, Akash, brings up such a great point, which is, there's sort of two things that create stress and strain on utopian intentional communities. One of them is size. There's some kind of magical limit. I think in one of your New Yorker pieces about this, you quote somebody saying, "I don't see how it can go more than 1,000 people." I think it's the person who's in that place in Virginia. I don't know how could it be bigger than that before things start to go pop. And the other one is what Avery was just talking about, which is the multi-generational question. Auroville's kind of amazing, right? Auroville's more than 50 years old.
Yeah. I think the multi-generational thing is really key, and it's probably linked to the size question. Somebody said something to me once, and I didn't manage to fit this in the book, but somebody said something about Oroville to me when I was growing up that was really powerful. He said, Oroville worked really well as long as people didn't have families. And it was the minute people started having kids that they sort of lost their commitment to the ideals. And I think what he was getting at there is the fact that it's fairly easy to deny things to ourselves and to sort of, commit ourselves to ideals. But once we start having genes that need our attention and that need our resources, the commitment kind of starts fraying. So I think the generational aspect of utopias is very hard. I think in Oroville's case, it is one of the interesting things that it's probably at this point one of the longest lasting, if not the most, if not the longest lasting intentional community around. It's been around for about 53 years. And we could talk about why that is, but part of the reason is because I think there actually aren't very rigid hierarchical rules as there are in many utopias, which does sometimes dim some of the original idealism and animating fire of the place. But it also means that people are a little bit freer. There's a little more room to acknowledge the complexity and the nuance of human nature. And frankly, people can, if people want to pay more attention to their families and to the ideals, or maybe for a certain period of their lives, there's room to do that.
Right. I think I'm going to hold some of this for our second segment because I want to talk more specifically about it. But I think you could also make the case that Oroville survived a kind of crisis that would have doomed most communities. I mean, Oroville had effectively a civil war at a certain point.
Absolutely. And if you see the history of these communities, whether it's Oneida or whether it's, many of these communities over time, I mean, they often hit a crisis point after the passing of their founder, right? Because the founder is the kind of the animating influence and then the force that holds them together. And then the founder is gone as, despite their attempts to kind of conquer mortality and reinvent human nature, the founder does end up leaving. And then these places often tend to fall apart. And that certainly happened in Oroville. Oroville was unusual because it pulled back from the precipice that I think many of these places tip over when the founder's no more there.
Avery, we should say a little bit about just the idea of communal living. I mean, I think a lot of the kind of hippie communes that sprung up in the late 60s, early 70s were also a reaction formation to a kind of seeking of loneliness that was documented in the work of sociologists at the time, Philip Slater, David Reisman, writing about the pursuit of loneliness, the lonely American, the idea that what people really wanted was 1 or 2 acres of land in a subdivision where they didn't really have to constantly come in contact with other people. They thought that would make them happy. The communitarian ideal is sort of the opposite of that. But that doesn't mean it's easy, right? I mean, in case after case, a whole bunch of people living together, trying to share a relatively small space is not necessarily an easy project. Maybe you could say a little bit about what you found there.
Yeah, entirely. I mean, it's really interesting because when you think about it, humans come together to collaborate in all kinds of ways. We come together in business settings, in offices, and factories. I mean, people are able to collaborate, but there has been this idea. I mean, going back as far as Aristotle, there's been this idea of the separate spheres, like the home life and the public life. And then it became this distinctly American, distinctly Christian ideal around the Victorian era when you get writers like Catherine Beecher, the older sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, writing these books that were basically saying, there's a divine duty in taking care of your private home. This was a book written for housewives, that your individual choices for how you feed your family, how you raise your children, how you clean your clothes, these are individual choices that really reflect on your soul in a Christian way. And so we've had this idea, again, very long held, but especially strong in America, especially, in an era where a lot of like white, lonely housewives were settling in this country in, freshly colonized areas far away from friends or family or any sort of community or help, that this was supposed to be something you did yourself, this domestic work. And that it was deeply, deeply personal. And it really trips us up when we have to think about how to share it. These sets of decisions, raising your kids, feeding yourself, feeding your family, cleaning your home, decorating your home, these decisions that have become so integral to who we think we are. And it's really hard to share those decisions with a group of other people.
Did you, in all of the research that you put into this, and not necessarily manifesting itself in one of the episodes, did you ever find a place where you thought, I wouldn't mind trying that? I'd be tempted to I'd give that a couple of years of my life.
I have to say, for all of these communities, there's always a moment where you're like, I think they were really onto something. I mean, even the example of Oneida that we were talking about. I mean, there was a moment where they were really ahead of their time. It was kind of incredible. And sure, if I were alive in 1850, I would rather live there than maybe anywhere else in the United States as a woman. And so I guess that's the other thing, as we were talking about what is failure and what is success and sort of the dark places that some of these communities can go in pursuit of perfection, that, we, in talking about their shortcomings, we really can't ignore, some of the beauty in their attempts and some of the glimmers in which they were really, really, really perhaps getting closer to the idea of utopia.
Although, Akash, I think also a lot of that depends on who the animating spirit is. I mean, Avery told us about, Hitler actually had 2 different utopian experiments, including one that she does an episode on, but he had another one that was going to be up in Norway, I think in Trondheim or something. Avery gave us Jamestown, but Jonestown was also theoretically a utopian intentional community until, of course, it pretty drastically wasn't. I mean, a lot of times we're trusting some kind of charismatic leader whose vision supposedly exceeds that of the outside world. The question is, what kind of person is that? And that, I guess, can be kind of the determining factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the problems, with the word utopia is it's a pretty squishy word that we can kind of stretch to encompass lots of things. I mean, it depends on what your take on it is, but essentially, if utopia means a radical alternative to the present, then it can encompass things that we think are great and things that we think are horrible. So, like, Pol Pot and the killing fields of Cambodia are sometimes referred to as a utopia. Not my idea of a utopia, but certainly was somebody's idea of a utopia. And as you say, the animating ideals, the person that sort of starts the place has a big role to play in determining the ultimate spirit of the place. I do think that in addition to the person or the specific ideal, I see this kind of the extent to which a place is tightly regimented and planned versus the extent to which it's a little loose and just allows for a little diversity and allows for the place to emerge in a kind of organic fashion plays a pretty key role. Because it's hard, as we know, it's hard to plan human nature and it's hard to plan the course of history. And so places that are over-determined, and often the over-determination leads from an overly regimented or overly hierarchical leader, often end up in the worst places, in my view.
Okay. And I just have to say...
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, just Margaret Atwood has this really useful turn of phrase, utopia. And it's this idea that someone's utopia is someone else's dystopia, and someone's dystopia is always someone else's utopia.
I do want to say I'm sitting one block away from Harriet Beecher's house, so we know from those we know from those Beecher sisters here where I live. So before we leave this segment, Avery, I want to go back to something that you said a little bit earlier, and I want you to flesh it out a little bit. You said that's why we have to keep trying. That's why we can't just say, none of this stuff works. Let's not do it ever again. Give us a little bit more about that. What is your thinking there?
Yeah, I just think that it's this idea of just like, I think it's really important to understand, of course, study those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. I think it's really important to talk about these experiments and look at the common patterns, which are really apparent. And I think it's worthwhile to try to go and think about other ways of living and other alternatives that could be possible to create, because I think the utopias and the experiments that fail get a lot of splash. They're like a better story, but I'm sure there are innumerable smaller arrangements that people have found that work for them that are very happy to not talk about it on a podcast. And I think we have to explore newer, richer alternatives to like the script that we are told, like this is how we are to live. This is how we are to find happiness. I think culture expands and our lifestyles should be able to expand with it.
That's Avery Trufelman, the host of the podcast Nice Try, about people who tried to design a better world. That was the first season. Are we prepared to say what the second season is going to be, or do I have to go to the big press conference?
It's about the domestic sphere and the separation of the spheres.
Oh, cool. I can't wait. The first season is terrific. I really want people to check it out. All right.
Thank you.
We're going to say goodbye to Avery. We're going to keep Akash to talk in the second segment about the specifics of his book, of this story, of this remarkable place called Oroville.
Savitri, Book 10, The Book of the Double Twilight. Canto 3, The Debate of Love and Death. This is Part 1. It's on pages 621 through 624. We have heard Death's arguments, and we have heard Death's reasoning. We have seen how he did his best to convince Savitri that her immortal love for Satyavan has no permanence, and that finally everything ends in death because he created a universe where everything dies. Savitri understands very well what death is and what he is trying to do.
That's actually from Oroville Radio. I discovered this also this morning. And that actually was a broadcast of Oroville Radio 2 days ago. You're hearing someone named Loretta discuss the work of Sri Aurobindo, who is the animating spirit of Oroville, or at least the first animating spirit of Oroville, and part of the source of Oroville's name. With us today is the author, Akash Kapoor, author of Better to Have Gone, Love, Death, and The Quest for Utopia in Oroville. All right, so we've been slinging this name around now for 20 or 25 minutes. I think maybe we better explain exactly what Oroville is. Can you give that a go?
Sure, I can give it a go. So, what you just cited from there was from an epic poem by an Indian freedom fighter turned philosopher and kind of yogi named Sri Aurobindo. And he was kind of a mystic. He formed this notion of integral yoga, which I can explain in more detail later. But basically, it was a reworking of traditional Indian thought. And he had this spiritual partner who helped build up a spiritual community around him. She was a French woman. Her name was Mira Alfassa. She became known as the Mother. And so she created Oroville in 1968. It was conceived of as this new town, this new project that would function as a laboratory for Sri Aurobindo's philosophy and Sri Aurobindo's yoga. International community, it drew people from around the world. It currently has about 3,000 people from around, I think, over 50 countries, spread out over a pretty big area in South India.
And let's mention that integrative yoga, because we're not talking about classes where people show up in spandex with their water bottles. We're talking about something that's much more comprehensive, that is, in a way, a thought utopia that turns into a physical utopia.
Yeah, I my publishers made me include a footnote about this in the U.S. edition to explain that yoga in this context doesn't mean stretching exercises. It's much more a kind of aesthetic or a way of being, not dissimilar maybe to sort of ancient Greek, ethics in life. So it's a much more integrated approach to life. And the integral yoga, which was again Sri Aurobindo's conception, it's an attempt to rework traditional Indian yoga or spiritual thought to update it in a way for the 20th century when he conceived of it. One of the things it did, traditional yoga is often based on a very ascetic path and a sort of a retreat from the world. And here there was an effort to infuse everyday life with spirituality, with the sanctity of spirituality. So he has this saying where he says, all life is yoga. So it's very connected to the world. Also, there was a very strong evolutionary strand in it, which I think of almost as a kind of Nietzschean strand. It was this idea that man is not the final being, that man is a step to a higher being, and that moreover, that man can will him or herself to that higher being through the practice of yoga.
And there's a sense that, and I think you alluded to this in the first segment too, that kind of ascendant and transcendent quality of the thought system is almost without bounds. Towards the end of her life, the mother is actually kind of retreats. She's in her 80s. She's still playing tennis, but she kind of retreats so that she can kind of see if she can explore some way to transcend death itself, right?
Yeah, that does end up happening. I mean, there was always this view that if one can will oneself to a higher form of life, then hypothetically, at least, immortality would be some kind of end game. And so, yeah, there is this effort towards the end of her life. As you say, she retreats to her room and she comes up with this notion of cellular transformation, which is that somehow she's going to transform her cells and infuse them with a spirit of immortality.
So you and your wife grew up there. You both left and then came back. I guess maybe I'd like to ask you, just for starters, when you were growing up there, were you thinking, wow, this is not the way everybody else is growing up? Or were you pretty insulated from that?
No, you're pretty aware of that. One of the things that there with a lot of these utopian communities is there tends to be a pretty big dissonance between the stated philosophy and ideals of the community and the way life's actually playing out on the ground. So a lot of the stuff we've just talked about, the integral yoga, cellular transformation, I mean, this was certainly there, and it was certainly people would talk about it around us, but when I was a kid, I wouldn't say that it was part of my day-to-day life. So we didn't have a sense that this is what we were living or that the adults of our world were trying to live out. But you certainly had a sense that you were part of a world that was trying to create something very different and that looked very different, because it's not like we were just, trapped in this little bubble. I mean, I had grandparents in rural Minnesota. I would go visit them every few years. And of course, life in a farming town in Minnesota was pretty different from life in my rural South Indian utopia.
Absolutely. And there's also, you had a great line. It's not in the book. I think it's in an article. I could be wrong. Where you said Utopia is really good at rebranding existing behaviors. So there's a way in which we all live a certain way, and maybe ultimately the community has to say, oh yeah, that actually really kind of does fit in with what we think.
Yeah. I think that line was from an article I wrote. Look, utopias always end up running up against the reality of human nature. And so inherent to every utopia is the idea that somehow you can remold human nature, that you can reshape what humanity is. And that's a pretty tough slog. I'm not saying that that's not a noble aspiration. I mean, we'd all like to reshape human nature in many ways. We're not the greatest creatures. But yeah, you keep running up against things, and the things you run up against are the things you'd expect. So money, acquisition, sex, family. And so, in terms of rebranding human nature, like the economy is a good example. We talked about this earlier. You create, instead of having money, you give everybody an account, and then they charge it with money. But when they go around the community, they use the account number rather than money. Well, technically, you're not using money, but it's pretty close.
Right, you might as well be. So this book, we should say, begins on the most haunting possible note. It begins with the very mysterious and not particularly well documented death of your wife's mother and her adoptive father, John. By the way, for those of you listening here in Connecticut, there are a lot of Fisher's Island scenes in this book. So your own landscape will be connected to Auroville in India. And I don't want to talk too much about that, because I think it's hard to talk about without introducing spoilers, and I don't want to do that. But this was an investigation by you of something that your wife didn't really at all know the truth of or understand. And I guess I'm sort of wondering, as you learned more about it, without sort of saying what it actually was, how did that change for both of you, the feeling about the place you'd grown up?
Well, first of all, thank you for not doing the spoilers. I think you're pretty much the only radio show I've done, or the only review that hasn't given away spoilers. So thank you for that, because there is a lot of mystery I'd like to preserve in the book. It did change things. I mean, one of the key things that we sort of unraveled as we were picking out the story was that these deaths that take place in the book, and I won't get into how exactly they happen, but we'd always seen them as individual deaths, two people that had kind of taken things to an extreme and died. And one of the key things that we unpacked, I say we, because my wife and I very much did this together, was understanding how these deaths really were very much linked to broader collective or communal processes and things that had been going on in the community, things that had been going on in Utopia. And so that clash between individuals and individual fates, and then the larger collective and the larger ideals, was something that really came out of my research, if you want to call it that, for the book. And it made me think really hard it made me rethink the idea of perfection and the pursuit of perfection and the pursuit of radical alternatives. And as noble as that impulse, and those impulses often are, the terrible, terrible human cost that individuals often pay for them.
So I think one of the other surprises for people, because in fact we have this kind of latent narrative in our heads about all this kind of stuff, that these communities would be immersive, and that if you left one, you wouldn't go back. I mean, I think we all, I don't know why we think our own society is so great, because most of the time we don't think that. But that once you're out of Auroville, once you're deciding which funky Brooklyn restaurant you're going to eat at tonight, there's going to be no part of you that says, actually, maybe I should go back there. Although, in fact, John, the person I just referenced, the person with the Fisher's Island connection, is essentially in that position. Maybe I should go back, and he does. So, I don't know. Is there a way you can articulate how it is that the two of you decided you would go back?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason for that narrative is that people often think of utopias or intentional communities and what they think of are cults. And there's a kind of conceptual slippage there that I've noticed sometimes in the reception to this book. And there's an assumption that a place like Oroville must be a cult. And I think, cults are a different creature. It's a different category of place. So these are not terrible places. They're places that have many shortcomings, particularly if you measure them up against their stated ideals. They often fail to live up to that. There's a lot of hypocrisy. But, as you suggested, we have that's true of the world. That's true of any society. And more than that, I have a line in the book somewhere where I say that children of utopian communities are like exiles. And what I mean by that, and I expand on it in the book, is that I think if you've grown up in these places with the idea that the world can be or should be different, then you grow up and you realize that it's a lot harder than you thought, and there's all kinds of failure and hypocrisy in it. But somehow that ideal is very much in your imagination, and it's very hard to escape that ideal, and it's very hard to just sort of walk away from the conception of an alternative. And I guess that's one of the reasons my wife and I, after living in the United States and having pretty successful lives, we moved back. And I don't think it was very conscious. It's not like we were rejecting the society and moving back. And in fact, we kept going back and forth a lot. But yeah, I think that sort of seeds in your imagination, this possibility of a better world.
Reading your book, I was constantly, I had ringing through my head that Nelson Mandela quote. I don't have it right in front of me. Oh, yes, I do. There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. Children and utopian communities, you alluded to it in the first segment, can be an uncomfortable fit. There are times in this book where, children really are not safe. One child is, in fact, doomed, and the signs of that doom precede the actual doom. There are poisonous snake bites and fires, and I'm just thinking this is just not a good situation. So maybe you could say a little bit about that, about children in a place like that.
Children are often victims of these places, and I think this goes back to the point I was making earlier about the human cost of ideals. So I think, some of the stuff you're alluding to there is more specific to the physical terrain and sort of physical dangers that people faced when they set up Oroville. And I would put that in a slightly different category. One of the things that I write about in the book that I think was a very dark period in the community's history is when the schools were shut down in the name of ideals and in the name of a kind of radical alternative vision of how kids should grow up and what they should be exposed to, and reinventing education along with everything else. And that, that's left a lot of scars. That's left a lot of people who many of whom still live in Oroville and actually love the community and are dedicated to the community, but feel haunted by those years where they were denied an education.
Right. There is a period where there's violence, there's questions about education, there's issues about whether there's enough food, really, whether it's even beyond kind of subsistence for food. And we're kind of alluding to that time of schism too. Listening to that, I think, wow, utopia? But somehow or other, this place, this community did push through all of that. I assume you think of Oroville now as a successful community. I don't know if you think of it as a successful utopian community.
Yeah, I definitely don't think of it as a successful utopian community. I think of it as a fairly successful community. I think of it as a real place that exists, that has many of the same flaws that anywhere else in the world has. And that has also been successful in many regards. So I'm not like a real idealist about it, but I think I do think that it's stepped into some pretty dark places, as these communities often do. And I think it's admirable that it stepped away from the edge of the precipice and kept going. I say somewhere in the book that these communities are like human beings. They have life cycles, and that Oroville is sort of at its middle age right now. So I think those very intense years of rampant idealism, if you were the teenage years when things went a little too far and everybody had the right answer and everybody knew everything. And somehow Oroville managed to push through those years, and it's middle age now. And so it's a little bit less idealistic. The fires burn a little less brightly, and some people do bemoan that. Personally, I'll take idealism when it's a little tempered over just like burning, raging idealism.
Right. There's actually a kind of, I found chilling line there in terms of everybody thinking that they knew everything, that one of the figures in the schism says, truth is schismatic. I thought, well, that's an interesting way.
That's a very Manichaean view of seeing the world. And that, unfortunately, is what many such communities often descend into. And again, I think Orville headed in that direction. And there were certainly groups or factions within Orville that would have taken it in that direction. But here it is, 53 years later, and it's much less sort of schismatic or Manichaean than it used to be.
Right. We have to stop there. But Akash Kapoor, what a book. Better to Have Gone, Love, Death, and the Quest for Utopia in Orville. I really do recommend people. This is your August read right here. Thanks so much for joining us today.
All right. Thank you so much for that.
All right. So we are going to spend the final segment with one of my favorite websites in the world, Atlas Obscura. Because really, you just have to go there and type in utopian and see what happens.
All alone, it makes for a good day for some serious reflection and massive rationalization for contemplating the future of the future and the past of the past, and wondering if you could ever forgive me, darling, all the trouble that I put to you, and if I could forget all those questions that I never asked, and if I could forgive the temporary weight gain due to excess of water retention.
All right, I'm pressed for time here, so I quickly have to thank Kat Pastor, our amazing technical producer, and WizKid Lily Tyson. She's the producer of this particular episode. We want to end with, as I said, one of my favorite websites, and really kind of appropriate because this is a website that also had a charismatic, almost cult-like leader, David Plotz, and somehow or other has managed to sort of survive after his departure. People who listen a lot know David Plotz is on this show a lot. So joining us now is Samir Patel, editor-in-chief of Atlas Obscura. Welcome to our show. And let me just say, first of all, I thought about it immediately when Lily pitched the show because Atlas Obscura really kind of documents oddities and anomalies and strange things all over the world. And whenever you travel, you want to find out what they know about it that nobody else knows. And so, Samir, it is the case that, you guys had a Utopia week, right? Where you just sort of showed off all the failed utopias you could find.
Yeah, we did. It was actually before my time. But there is a definite theme that runs through our database of wondrous and sometimes odd and strange places around the world, that there are these locations of where there were failed utopias, in part because they have wonderful stories behind them or sometimes really interesting architecture that people can still visit today.
Right. One of them, and I've been to this place, Arcosanti, it's in Arizona, a little bit north of Phoenix, and it has all of that, right? It has incredibly compelling architecture and a pretty interesting story. Once again, a single visionary person, an architect.
Yeah, in this case, it was an architect, an Italian-American architect named Paolo Soleri, who in the 1970s wanted to create, I think it was probably less conceived as a utopia and more as a kind of architectural urban planning experiment out in the Arizona desert called Arcosanti. And he had built it on this idea of, a new vision of urban life that he called arcology, a mixture of archaeology and ecology. And it's still out there today. And there are still people who live there, and thousands of people who've passed through to volunteer their time to help build it.
Yeah, the population has dropped. I think it was supposed to house 5,000 people. There's usually around 50 to 150 people there these days. Although, not unlike Oneida, maybe we can circle back to Oneida in just a second, but not unlike Oneida, they figured out a consumer product to help them keep alive. They have these amazing bells that they make there, bells and wind chimes and stuff like that. And those are also still being sold, and the money goes to the Soleri Foundation. It's probably worth noting also, Soleri is unsuccessful. He runs through his money too fast. Things just don't really work out. The place has a kind of deserted Ursula Le Guin novel feeling to it. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, he's essentially right. If we had figured out how to do the stuff that he wanted to do, we would be using photovoltaic paneled houses and wind farms as primary sources of power. We would probably have less of a problem with climate change if we were more Solarian, right?
Yeah, his vision was, in an academic sense, like a beautiful one of high density urban housing that's more connected to the environment around it, of efficiency and community interaction in a way that's sort of that's natural and organic. And it does sound like a beautiful place. I think obviously there's complications to living in a place like that, particularly in the desert. But it is, as articulated, something that would be a beautiful vision if it could be implemented on a wider scale.
Right. Now, Solari, well, first of all, Arcasandi is still kind of there, kind of wheezing along. Yeah. Some of the other places don't last that long at all. And one of them, the Maryhill Museum and Stonehenge, it's not Stonehenge itself, there's sort of a Stonehenge replica. I mean, this is one where the utopian community really didn't last very long. It's just the stuff that got built that kind of hung around, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure the utopian community ever happened there. So Mary Hill was built by a man named Sam Hill in Washington State, and he was a Quaker and had intended to make in this sort of remote region, not desert but sort of more mountainous, a Quaker farming community, which in its own way is a kind of utopian community, and one that's persisted because there are still Quakers today, and they have championed a lot of wonderful social causes. And but I don't know that anyone ever really showed up. And the community that he built there, it burned down, but the manor house in which he had plans to live himself with his family is now the Maryhill Museum, which is a very interesting, eclectic kind of museum. It has Art Nouveau items and Native American items, and also a big portion of the collection of Queen Marie of Romania, who was friends with Hill. And there is as you say, a replica of Stonehenge, which he had built as a monument to the fallen of World War I. So that was sort of a utopia that never got a chance to make its presence felt.
I think, it is obviously there's sort of a fascination for us with the way that these things often do have a little bit of an air of ineffectuality, as Akash Kapoor would say, that, there's a specter that hangs over the places, and it's the specter of failure. But there's also, I think, when we travel, I mean, at least when I travel, I don't want to see a life like the one that I live, right? I don't want to see more Walgreens or Rite Aids or, Shell stations or, I mean, in a way, and this is very much the spirit of Atlas Obscura, but especially with these kinds of places, these are places where people tried to live differently. So there's something very attractive about that, right?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, part of what we love to highlight at Atlas Obscura, or what we think of as hidden histories, and those can be, in the Walgreens parking lot because something interesting had happened there in the past, but also, as you say, in these places that are architecturally interesting, that have this backstory because they are attempts for people to find another way to live. And I think that understanding the way that other people have lived and would want to live, and the ideals that form communities, is something that enriches our experience when we visit them, which is why I think that some of these sites of utopian experiments or urban planning experiments continue to be really interesting to people and places that people want to visit.
All right, we're kind of out of time, but Atlas Obscura has plenty of time for you. So get on the site, and there's a whole Utopia Week tab that you can click and find out about even more of these kinds of things. Samir Patel is the editor-in-chief of Atlas Obscura. Thanks to everybody who listened today, and to Kat Pastor, once again, to Lily Tyson, WizKid producer. She did it again. This has been a great episode. Thanks for listening, as I said before, and we will see you tomorrow.
They'll learn much more than I never knew, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself,